Hello and welcome to Muse Jam session recording 208. My name is Dani Beaumont and I'm a Principal Product Manager on Adobe Muse. Thanks for joining us today. Last week we talked about the latest release of Adobe Muse and some of the bugs that were there with the release. And when we first announced this latest release, we did a lot of major work with responsive design and how you build out breakpoints and how you work with elements on the site. And I feel as though, in a lot of ways, we really need to slow things down with a stable build of Adobe Muse that's currently in pre-release. It's really possible to start to take a look at the feature enhancements that we have and start to really use them in your projects. So I've been asked from time to time by folks to explain how fluid width behavior works and responsive height and width and pinning works. And the reason why I call this a jam session, by the way, is because in a jam you play together. So it's an opportunity for me to learn from the users and users to learn from me or the Muse team by way of me. And part of what I've realized is that I do understand pinning pretty well, not perfectly well, but pretty well. So part of what I need you to do with me in this session is shout out the things that you don't understand. So this is being presented by way of Facebook Live. If you're joining us in that way, adding any comments or questions that you have to the comment section on Facebook is an excellent idea. If you're on the Zoom screen sharing, you're welcome to put them into the question area there or the chat pod. So when you get used to a product and you spend a lot of time with it, you forget what those first impressions are like. So I want to slow things down and really take stock of the basics around working with sites that you're building out as a responsive design. So I did a little bit of playing this morning, actually very late last night. I had a call with one of our quality engineers. His name is Sanjit, and he spent some time actually showing me some of the test files that the team is using to look at how we're defining our pinning and fluid width and height behaviors. And I've kind of translated that into a working site. Not a working site, a working page that I played with a little bit today. What I'm going to show you is going to be a balance of all of that. When you see some of the test files, if you're at all of an artist, your eyes will roll back, and it will make the Altura site actually look really well designed, which I'm saying it's not. But we're going to go ahead and just kind of look at the nuts and bolts of what's going on here. The first thing I do want to mention, let's go ahead, I'm trying to think quickly what would be a good site to show. Let's see. Let's go to the Altura website. I'm not positive it's going to have everything I want to show, but in its most basic sense, the idea behind responsive Muse is that as a visual designer, you can pull that on File to New in Adobe Muse. You can lay out elements on your design. The Muse application takes responsibility to look at that structure and translate it into a fully responsive website that a browser can load. And when that happens, well, to step back for a moment, I still do not know of any tool on the market that allows you to free-form design a responsive, multiple breakpoint website. And there's probably a good reason for that. The web is an open standard, but content on the web does need to follow a certain structure: HTML, CSS, JavaScript. There's expected code, things like media queries, that affect how a site is going to load on an individual device. It's incredibly ambitious to not constrain what we would call guardrails, to not constrain your design process, to make sure that what you're designing will translate into the web page appropriately. We believe in the approach we've taken, but I do believe as a visual designer, once again, there are rules on the web that you need to keep in mind as you build out a site. We can just let you freely do your work, but I think you'll be more successful if you understand how what you're doing does translate to the web. So one of the first things I want to do is actually bring up a site that we showed at Adobe Max. Max is coming up in about a month in Las Vegas this year. I think it's the week of October 15th. I'm doing a full day pre-conference, full day training on everything from Muse from beginning to end. And then there's 3 days of conferences where there will be Muse sessions. But at Max last year, we had some speakers from the community. And Ali Pordelli of Cookie.com put together a session on tips and tricks for Max. And he put together a page that I think is pretty terrific to show off how pinning behaves in its most basic sense. So let's start first with this idea of pinning objects. I'm going to just bring up this test page that Ollie designed because it really does kind of very visually show what your options are when you're pinning for a design. So before I do that, let's come into Adobe Muse, and I'm just going to pick on the page that I'm showing here, just kind of recursive, but I've got a page that's designed. It's got a 1200 pixel width. It's a fluid width breakpoint, so that basically as I scrub the browser, content will move within that breakpoint. And I have individual icons here that Ollie designed, and each icon is indicating a different pinning feature. So what you'll notice is he actually created an icon that shows the main pinning for browser level pinning. So if you look on your screen, this is way too recursive. Let's go in and just create a rectangle here for a second. And I'll give it a fill so we can see what we got going on. So with this object selected on the canvas, what I can do is define responsive attributes. And if I come over here into the control panel, you can see these pinning choices. Now, back in the day when Muse first occurred and did not have responsive behavior, we allowed you to pin objects to the browser. So if you had a logo, for example, or navigation that you wanted to remain constant at the top of your screen, you would use this pinning interface here to define those attributes. When we introduced responsive design, there was a different level of pinning, and we came up with a second little icon set here that indicates responsive pinning. And the difference there is that rather than pinning to an edge of the browser, you're pinning in relationship to other objects within a fluid or fixed breakpoint. So I know it's a complicated concept. I'm trying to slow it down and break it down a little bit here. But if you keep in mind this sort of pinning interface, and we look at the design that Ollie's created here, what you'll notice is I've got an object here on the left-hand side, and it is pinned to the upper left-hand corner of the browser. So by definition, that means that well, to step back for a second, when you pin an object, you really want to mentally think of something like a crowbar. See how, this is why we have a webcam, so you can see my hand gestures. The crowbar creates a fixed distance from another object, from the edge of a browser, the corner of a browser. So in the application, if you look at that first setting, this first object has been pinned to the upper left-hand corner of the browser. And the fixed distance from that corner, so the distance that you see here and the distance that you see there, that fixed distance is going to be retained no matter how much I resize the browser from that browser edge. Comparatively, at the top center here, I have another icon, and that icon is pinned to the center of the site. So if I click on that, you can see that it's center pinned. Now, before the world of responsive design, for the most part, if you say File New in Muse and you look at your settings option, before the world of responsive design, we had this idea of fixed width sites. So if I go in and create a fixed width site, and in fact, we probably got rid of it. So an older, let me just look here. Yeah, there you go. So you may or may not ever have noticed it, but in the early days of Adobe Muse, if you said File New, it would by default center all of the content in the design. You had the ability to left align it, but for the most part, just about every website that you load, even if it's archaic, it's going to basically center the content based on the width of the browser, center it right there in the center. You do have the ability to align everything to the left, but you really rarely see websites in the last 10 years that do that. So when I come in and select this object and say that I want it pinned to the top of the browser, the assumption is that that crowbar will keep it locked to the top of the browser, but I can have variable width in that browser, and the width of the browser can change, and that object's going to stay centered. The one on the right, as you might expect, is pinned to the upper right-hand corner, and that crowbar is applying to the left, to the right side of the browser and the top side of the browser. Now, as we progress down, what Ollie's done is added a container here. Because those top elements are actually pinned in the browser, they're not going to move. They're going to remain constant. And as you scroll down on the page, he created a container to kind of cover that over and show some of these other pinning scenarios. So I have another object here that's center pinned, not using browser level pinning. This is using responsive pinning. So notice it's that second icon set there, and different configs. So you'll notice that this is placed in the center and center pinned. This one is also center pinned, but it's offset a bit from the center line. Same thing on the right here, except inverted. And then I've got another one that's not pinned at all. I'm going to go ahead and center that guy a little bit better. I'm going to scroll on down. We'll take a look at this in the browser in a second. We have a second set of content where this one, using not browser level pinning, but responsive pinning, it's crowbarred in essence to the left-hand side. This object, notice it's placed on the left, but it's not crowbarred. When you place objects in a fluid breakpoint and you don't pin them at all in the responsive pinning options here, what happens instead of absolute crowbar-like pinning, right, is something known as percentage-based placement. So mentally what you want to think to yourself is, in a 1200 pixel space, right, this breakpoint, I've got an object that's, let's say it's placed about 10 or 15% in of the overall distance. And I could calculate that out if I'd have thought about it earlier. But basically, let's say it's 20% inset on that 1200 pixel breakpoint. The behavior that you see when you don't pin an object, but you place it and it invokes the percentage-based pinning, is that if I were to reduce the width of the browser to half, let's say 600 pixels, the distance here is going to reduce to half, right? Because it's using percentages of the overall breakpoint to determine the placement of this object. We're getting somewhere, I swear. On the right-hand side, I'm using kind of just the flip side. So this is responsive pinning, pinned to the right-hand side. I have another object that, interestingly enough, it's not pinned, right? If I select it, it has no pinning defined there. And it's, I would say, 80% of the way across, with 20% on the right-hand side. And then as we get down to the bottom of the page, we have browser level pinning again. So pinned to the lower left, lower center, and lower right. All right, let's go look at this magic. I'm going to refresh that because one of the icons was a little offset. And let's break this down a little bit. So what you'll notice is, in my browser level pinning, no matter how much I scroll down on the page, those objects are not moving. I can cover them up. I can actually scroll underneath them. You'll see this with logos an awful lot, navigation for a desktop device on the right-hand side. But those are going to stay there forever. They may become invisible, but they're really still there underneath the container that's going to move up on top of it. If I press and drag the edge of the browser, notice what happens. The center line is going to remain centered. These objects are going to remain pinned, but the distance, that absolute distance, will be retained. It's not going to diminish in a percentage-based way because that crowbar is connecting it to the edge of the browser. Scroll on down here. I've got center pinning from the responsive pin set. Now, the question is, how is this any different than this guy right here? It's fundamentally different only in the fact that this is pinned to a fixed distance from the top of the browser, and responsive pinning is pinned in relationship, I'd say, to the width of the browser, but it's going to scroll up and down. So it moves up and down, but it's definitely pinned horizontally. Next object, remember we had this one is also center pinned, but it's pinned in relationship to that center, and it has its distance. Now in theory, yeah, not yet. This one is center pinned, so we know it's pretty much absolutely centered. This is absolutely centered with some distance here. This one's offset a little bit, but same behavior. Notice this one here, if I come back out a little bit more fully, this guy probably, I don't remember. Notice we're at about 1400 pixels. If we get down to about 1200 pixels, right about there, where it should be emulating that design canvas that we were looking at. And notice that this object is placed. It has no pinning. It is not pinned to browser, is not pinned to the responsive choices. So this is going to take advantage of that percentage-based pinning that I talked to you about. So if I come in and reduce the width of the browser to about 600 pixels, let's come on down here, maybe, close enough, right about there. Notice that this is relatively staying placed at about the same percentage it was when it was double the width. These objects, I can keep going. Notice they're going to trim off because there's that crowbar from the center line. If I keep coming down here, you'll notice the difference between things that are hard pinned, using that pin metaphor there, versus just placed and are using percentage pinning. So this object is going to move, and this one is going to remain fixed. Same with this guy. It's all the way over in that 80% range. If I cut things to half, it's going to remain 80% across the distance there. And then as we get down towards the bottom, we've got that browser level pinning. So if I were to, let's say, come all the way back up to the top, this may or may not work, and bring, yeah, notice how this can get rather confusing. I'm bringing the bottom of the browser all the way up. So I'm, in essence, changing the overall height of the browser. Those bottom pinned objects are going to remain that fixed distance to the browser's edge, and they become visible even though they're lying underneath that container. I can see that they're always there in both instances. All right, let's kind of take this and put it into action a little bit. I'm going to stop and check to see who's talking about what. So my ask is, as we're talking, shout out the things you don't understand, and let me make an attempt to shout out some answers. So let me read for a minute. It's hard to read and speak at the same time. Generally speaking, if you are working with the shipping version of Muse from June, I highly encourage you to install the pre-release that we have at museprerelease.com. It's in beta. It is very stable. We are in a kind of a final bug fix phase. We did some major changes to the responsive behavior of the composition widget, the slideshow widget, and contact forms. It brought up some bugs that, again, because we allow you to create very freeform designs, we didn't see right away. We think we've squelched all of those bugs, but it's all hands on deck. We encourage you to install that new pre-release build. It won't overwrite your shipping build, okay? It's going to install right alongside, but open up your files. Make sure you don't see any issues. If you do, please let us know. We are shooting to release this new version with all of the responsive widgets and fixes at about Adobe Max timeframe, so about the middle of next month. So Philip is echoing on that a little bit. Philip, try out the beta. I encourage you. The other part about it is, as Mark mentions, the engineering team is about to make a big change to our installer and our versioning. So there is not a pre-release to download today. But please check back in about 24 hours and we should have a Mac and Windows build there at that point. So sorry about that, folks. So Gavin's saying rather than how to work with bugs, Muse could just fix them. We are fixing them, Gavin. That's what I'm saying, is that we're under the impression that the bugs have been fixed, and we encourage you to give it a good go. Okay. All right, I'm going to keep going. As I mentioned, I think I saw one comment that said, finally, this is starting to make pinning make more sense. So I'm going to be encouraged by that. We're going to go ahead and keep going on this. All right, let's jump back now to the design, and I'm going to just start to play with it practically a little bit. So I was fiddling with this Altura picnic site and starting to just build out some of the basics. One of the things, so given everything I just showed you about pinning, I think you would understand that when there are so many choices, right? Let's go back to this page for a second. We talked about so many different combinations, and they're vaguely represented here. And all we're talking about is pinning objects. We haven't even gotten into placing images or text and defining responsive height and width for those objects. So with all the combinations of pinning that are out there, one of the things that Muse Engineering's been putting some time on is, can we build in some better logic so that it's easier for you when you do, say, File New, and you drag a widget on the canvas, or you place an image inside a widget container, so that the logic makes more sense to you and we intuit a little bit more intelligently what you specifically want to do. So this has been the heavy lifting that we've been involved in this past month as we've fine-tuned this particular release. So let me show you a little bit more of what I mean there. I'm going to jump out to a page I was working on. And as I mentioned, I kind of cracked this open this morning, and I wanted to just kind of take it slowly. I'm working on a new design that we'll bring out at Max, and it's always, every time I start from scratch, I am reminded about all of the choices that you have as you work with content. So in this design, I wanted to kind of talk about all the worlds of responsive behavior. So I began by defining a page that had its largest breakpoint as a fixed breakpoint. To this day, in order to use scroll effects, the native scroll effects built into Adobe Muse, you need to define fixed breakpoints. Now, depending on the design you're doing, you may be fine with that. Fixed breakpoints are a terrific methodology, usually for everything but the smallest mobile layout. You usually want that to be a fluid breakpoint. But sometimes, even if you're designing a fully responsive website, you kind of want to take advantage of some of the scroll effects capabilities that are available in Muse with fixed breakpoints. So I went ahead and set one breakpoint at 1400, consider it from 1400 to infinite width. So anything from, actually, this is the way the responsive design world works, is when you define a fixed breakpoint at 1400, you're really saying that all of the content should be right here at about 1200. See how my page starts right here? And everything I see to the right of that is actually the browser. So all of my content on this breakpoint should be right at that 1200 point or smaller. This is a 1200 breakpoint that I've defined with browser visible up to 1400 in this example. So what I wanted to do is take advantage of that parallax background scrolling that you see quite often out there in the world. So I went ahead and set that as a fixed breakpoint, and then I set another breakpoint at 1200 pixels that is a fluid breakpoint. And I started to define some of those fluid attributes. But starting at that 1400 pixel breakpoint, I mentioned that I wanted that sort of two different scroll effects. I wanted the logo to fade away, and I wanted the background image here to have parallax scrolling. So when I placed this on the canvas, what I did is created a container, and I pasted the image inside that container. And then I set the responsive behavior for the image inside that container. It's set to scale to fill, which means that no matter how wide or how tall that container is, the image will always fill it. So if it gets smaller, it will start to trim content on one side or another, but it will always fill the container. and I set a position for how the responsive behavior should behave. So because I've got grass, I kind of want everything to grow from the grass up, which is always a good idea when you're growing grass. They're centered in the container. And then I went over to the scroll effects and I applied a simple parallax effect. So you'll notice that I have scroll motion enabled, beginning at the very top, so at 0, and it's moving actually 0.2 times the speed of scroll, which is pretty darn slow. It's usually at about 0.8, but you can play with that. The other thing I did, because I have the ability to do it here on this fixed breakpoint, is for the logo, I set it to not scroll. So notice that everything's set to 0. This is a different way that you can pin objects. So it's in essence pinned in place by way of the scroll effect. And then on the second tab, I went in and set the transparency from 100% visibility to 0. So it would fade away over about 157 pixels, in fact. So with just that defined, let's kind of take a look at the page. I'm going to preview it in the browser, and I'm going to go to that larger breakpoint, so something larger than 1200 pixels. And you'll notice that as I scroll down, those two behaviors are happening. One is that the background image is moving at 0.2 times the speed of scroll. The other thing I did is I created a white container on my design canvas because that image is not really going anywhere. It's kind of like the pinning behavior we saw in the browser pinning. It's going to stay back behind there. I want to just cover it up after a fashion. So if I were to move the white container up, you'd still see the grass underneath. That's kind of the nature of this scroll effect as I'm working. So I have that white overlay, and that you'll also notice that my logo goes from being fully visible to fading away. Now, if I drag my breakpoint to something smaller than 1200, so if I get into right around there and look at the page, let's try that again. Helps if I'm at actual size, makes everything better. All right, we're going to bring that down to something slightly less than 1200, which jumps me to that next breakpoint. And notice that I have kind of a traditional header here now. Nothing's really happening. So the same image that I defined at the slightly larger breakpoint with the scroll effect applied to it, I've changed those attributes on a fixed breakpoint to just scroll off the page. All right, so that's one responsive behavior to images that you define as a fill inside a container. So it's a background fill as far as the web is considered, and you have the ability to define that responsive behavior. If I click on this object with the scroll effects panel open and jump to the 1200 breakpoint, notice that Muse is letting me know that when you have a fluid width breakpoint, the metaphor we're using for scroll effects doesn't work. You can't set the distance from the top of the browser for an object, because if the object above it is flowing, it's going to move that down on the page. There are some really terrific third-party widgets that allow you to define scroll effects on fluid and fixed breakpoints. So I encourage you to go to the widget directory and play with some of those. I was working with them this week, and they're a lot of fun. In some ways, they're just more like a PowerPoint mindset about animations within your layout. All right, so scroll effects handled now at this point. In the larger breakpoint, because we're talking about things that are not fluid in any way, they're all pretty fixed, kind of the old world of responsive, I have some objects that are here. I have SVG graphics. I basically created a container, and I filled the container with the SVG graphic, and I set it to scale to fit that container. I don't mind if there's sort of white or empty space on either end because it has a transparent background. So scale to fit assures that it's always going to fit inside the container, and the point that I'm pinning there, I should probably center pin these objects just for good measure, but it really doesn't matter because it's going to always fit that content in the container. So I'm a big fan that logos, things like buttons, icons, don't necessarily really need to scale within a breakpoint. So we're now on that fixed breakpoint. It's pretty irrelevant, but notice that these objects, let me just see what we got set here. In the largest breakpoint, I want to make sure that they're set to none for a resize. I just want them to be there. I don't want any fluid behavior. For the text objects, it really doesn't matter because they're not going to resize because I'm in a fixed breakpoint. So I have them set at resize none. And by default, I haven't pinned them, just sort of as a bit of a test. So when you're designing, because of the web and because of the different behaviors of content, be it SVG graphics, text containers, and images that might be set to either be responsive in width, responsive in height and width, you're going to want to play with different pinning features on fluid breakpoints. For now, as I mentioned, everybody can stay the way they are. They're not pinned at all. I want to just take a look at how things behave in this design. So let's go ahead and take a look at, keep in mind, the largest breakpoint. So I'm going to drag this out and make sure I'm back out to something greater than 1200 pixels. I'll scroll on down, and I have my 2 bits of content here. I've got activities and activities, funny that. As I resize, notice that the content is remaining centered on the page, but it's not flowing, it's not fluid in any way. All right, that's what I would expect, kind of old school responsive design. And it's all good until I start to run out of room. And right at about that 1200 pixel point, I decided I was going to run out of room. So one of the things I would do just to keep myself sane as you work, these different pinning and responsive behaviors can be really complex. So what I do quite often as I'm working is I'll come on in and select all of this content. Let's try that again. I do have that white container there in the background. I kind of forget about that from time to time. I've made it visible on my largest breakpoint, and I've hidden it for the other breakpoints because I don't need it when I'm not doing that parallax scrolling effect. For each of these objects, I'll come in and select them. And one area that the Muse application could use some improvements is to have a visual metaphor here to indicate mixed pinning states. We don't have that, and it makes me nervous. I'm sure it makes you nervous as you're working. So all of these objects should not be pinned, but I couldn't really tell when I select them all. There's not a visual metaphor for that right now. One thing I can do to sort of make certain that nothing is pinned is go ahead and pin it, and then click again, which will override any of the pinning settings for the group that I've just set. So with that defined now, I'm going to go ahead and right-click, and I'm going to copy the size and the position to my next smallest breakpoint, the 1200 pixel breakpoint. And I'll go ahead and select that. So I'm just saying everything I've done here, go ahead and carry it over to the next breakpoint. I'll jump over to that next breakpoint, and now we're talking about a fluid behavior, a fluid breakpoint. So as I look at each of my objects, I don't have scroll effects applied here. I've defined this as a scale to fill the browser width here. So if I were to show this off a little bit, I just come on in and I can create a container, and I can right-click to paste a background image if I have it on the clipboard. I can always pull down on File to go browse for that image. In the resize dropdown, I like to just kind of select stretch to browser width, which will make sure that it goes out to the edges of this fluid breakpoint for me. And then I'm going to make sure that the pinning within that container is still set to, as we know, let the grass grow up, right? The Altura logo, I don't want the logo to pin in the upper corner of the browser because I don't want it to stay as everything goes by. I want it to actually move off screen. But I do want to make sure that it's got a fixed distance from the edge of this responsive edge, browser edge. So I've gone in and pinned it using responsive pinning to the right-hand side. As we move down on the page, these objects should not have any pinning attributes set at all. Now my logos, I'm a big fan, as I mentioned, of not really scaling them. There's no way a browser is going to get so small that that gets cropped off necessarily. So I like in the resize panel to set that guy to none. And I have some text that's here. I've got activities. You'll notice that I've gone ahead and made the text area, the headline, the same width as the body text. You don't have to do that, but if you think about the normalizer, the rendering from Muse design to code in the browser, the Muse engine has to kind of come through with, it's almost like a knife. They're going to cut everything down and across and try to make orderly structure out of its content. Making your text containers, when they're stacked, the same width when possible is a good idea. I'll even kind of stretch this concept out a little bit. Another thing that's awfully nice is if you want to have a consistent responsive behavior to two blocks of text and they're different amounts of text, another good kind of rule of thumb is to make sure the container with less text is the same height as the container that has more text. Your chances of things remaining structured are better. Now I've got a gutter or a gap that's defined here. I'm going to tighten it up just a little bit. So I'll move this guy over, and then I'll grab everybody and just make sure they're centered within the canvas. And as I mentioned, nobody's pinned yet, right? Everybody is not pinned. So if we go back to that mental metaphor, I'm using percentage-based pinning or layout for the content that I have here. So let's take a look at that 1200 pixel breakpoint and see where things are landing. So I'm going to jump down and make sure that I'm in that new breakpoint. So this is that that scroll effects fixed breakpoint. Anything under 1200 is going to be the new design that I have. Let's go ahead and stretch this out so that we can see. First off, my background image is scaling to fill the container. Notice that the grass is never getting cropped off. I get more sky because it's scaling based on that bottom pin. And the Altura logo is remaining a fixed distance from the corner of the browser right here. As I come down on the page, some funny stuff is happening. So you're like, okay, Dani, why is everything falling apart? Sometimes I don't know why, but I know that the behavior in the browser of images as compared to text is different. So I'm going to want to come in and start to play around with pinning when I see this movement. So right now I have, within this breakpoint, nothing's flowing in its container. The text is kind of staying in line with one another, but my images are moving out. So the next, when in doubt, don't pin anything. See how it goes. If you need to, go back and apply pinning, but do so because you know that the content is not doing what you expect. I'm going to come on in and I'm just going to sort of play a little bit here. Let's try to select my icons, and I'm going to pin them not to the browser edge, but to the responsive pinning layer. With that said, I'm going to go back out and take a look at what I've got going on. Now, I don't have to do this in the browser. I can do it in the design canvas. I'm just kind of a big fan of preview in browser. So I'm getting better behavior, but things are still not staying intact with one another. So let's go back out and let's go ahead and select all of these objects and let's center pin them. And we'll check it one more time. Coming on down, things are looking better. Notice that my content is doing well, but it's kind of, it's obviously being clipped, right? Because my text containers are greater than the browser. So I'm going to come on in now, and I'm going to, for good measure, I don't know that I have to do this, but I'm going to select the headlines, even though the container is quite large, and there's no chance that activities is going to end up wrapping on a new line. I'm still going to select it along with the text below it, and I'm going to set the responsive width behavior to be fluid width, and then take a look at the content again. So I'll preview in the browser, come on down, and within this breakpoint now, I grab that edge. Still getting a little wonky. All right. Let's come on in and unpin these guys. And click our heels together. All right, now I'm getting the behavior that I need. So troubleshooting, yes, I had to play around a little bit, but I'm getting the fluid behavior I want with my text containers, and my graphics are staying where they need to stay as I go along. Now, because it's a little bit of hunt and peck behavior, we want to try to make some of the out-of-box behaviors with objects a little more intuitive. If you've used Muse in the past and you're using a new version, you might be like, hey, why did that go away? I don't quite understand. maybe Muse got broken. We are consciously controlling some of the pinning attributes based on the types of objects that you're placing. So let's go into another scenario here. So I'm going to come to another page. I was playing with this morning a little bit. Let's say I'm starting from scratch. So if I were to open up an older design that had a composition widget in it, you'll see different behaviors if you design that in a fixed Breakpoint website and then you open it up in New Muse. Then I'm going to have, when I drag the widget out on the canvas, that's because we're trying to make sure that we don't change the old designs that you've done and the old behaviors that you assumed, even though we have new functionality with the widgets. So I'm going to come into the widget library and I'm going to select a composition widget and I'm going to drag that out onto the canvas. Now, in Muse engineering terms, a composition widget consists of triggers and targets. These are known as disjointed rollovers in the web world. But basically, when I do something on this trigger, it will show up the target that's associated with it there. Now, one big thing, if you've lived in our old world and our new world, is if I just place this on the canvas, notice the little pinning metaphor here. I've placed it on the canvas. Nothing by default is pinned, so it's set for that percentage-based pinning. If I just come on in now, notice that on this page I don't have any breakpoints. It's just a fluid width 1400 pixel breakpoint. As I press and drag, we're defining a fluid behavior for this widget out of the box. So I can click on individual items to see what that default fluid behavior is. If I just click on the object as a whole, notice that I can't resize it as a whole here. I've got X's that indicate I've selected the group, but that I can't really just drag to resize it. I can use the fluid behavior to resize it in the browser, but on the design canvas, I can't do that in that way right now. That's something that we're looking at. If I click a second time to select the target, notice that that target has basically responsive width defined for it. I can change that to none if I want to. I can say no matter what happens in that breakpoint, I want it to be fixed. But by default, it's going to be fluid width. And each of the containers, notice they're also set to responsive width or fluid width behavior. Okay, it's not responsive height and width, but for this widget, that container is going to be responsive width only. Now, this is where you've got a whole bunch of tools in your kitchen. How you bake your cake or cook your cook your dinner is up to you. If I wanted to place images here that I wanted to make sure they were responsive height and width, if we were in a room and we were truly having a jam session together, I would ask you to raise your hand to tell me how I would be able to place an image that's going to scale height and width. But I'm talking to myself as usual. So what I would do is place that image as a background image in that container. And when I do that, remember that I can say, all right, so this container is going to remain. Let me just do this a little bit because I think it's interesting. I'm going to go grab some images. Let's just take this guy. And I'm going to place it here, cut it onto the clipboard, come on into this trigger, and I'm going to paste it as a background image. Now, I may want to make sure that that scales height and width. I can come in here, set it to be centered, and set it to basically scale to fit, right? Notice that I get those bars on either end because it's a little taller than it is shorter. If I change the background fill to be nothing, and I come on in and make these a little larger, let's say something like this. And then I space these guys out a little bit using magic keyboard commands. Notice that effectively, as I resize this guy, let me just show you. As the image is starting to be clipped in essence on one side, notice that it's remaining proportional. I'm not saying this is a good behavior for a trigger target in the composition. I just want to show you that, let's say you had an icon and you wanted it to scale, and you wanted to make sure that icon didn't just have scalable width, because that's going to clip it on the sides. You can define that placed object to be scaled height and width as a background image that you set to scale to fill or scale to fit the container. Okay? I'm telling you, it's a big kitchen. There's a lot of tools to talk about. Let's keep going. We'll just ignore that lovely little icon that we have there. And let's place some content here within this container. So I'm going to go grab 2 more images, this one and this one. And when I place them, let's say I'll put one, try that again. One I'll stick about here, one I'll stick about here. And I'm going to go ahead and trim them down. So I'm going to hold the Command key and just kind of make them a little bit more square-ish. Not perfectly, or portrait-ish. All right, so I have 2 images that are here now. They were placed. They're not background fills, right? So because they are placed, I have the ability to say, what behavior do I want? Now, again, different tools in the kitchen. Responsive width and height when I place an image. If instead I wanted to be able to just define responsive width, if I wanted it to trim on the sides, I can do that. What I would do is come on in, draw a container, go grab a different image. I'm going to cut that to the clipboard, come back to this guy here. I, of course, could have pulled in on fill to browse for the image. I'm just trying to make life simple for myself. I'm going to paste as a background image. And I can now come in and say, go ahead and set that to scale to fill. And I will go ahead and center it. If we just look at what we've got here now, I haven't pinned anybody. I've just placed it. Notice that these images are, the one that I placed last is responsive width, right? Because I define it as a background image. This one is width and height. This one is width and height. And nothing is pinned. You say to me, Dani, how come the pinning went away? The reason for that is, as we look at the engineering architecture that's going on here, if you define something as either fluid width or fluid height and width, pinning is inappropriate within that container, okay? It's not going to do you any favors. So if I press and drag, notice that I'm getting the behaviors that I expected, and I want to really break these down. I told you this is slow motion here today. I've got responsive height and width, and responsive width only. So notice how that's behaving. It's also placed within the container, and it's using percentage-based placement. So it's not hardwired, it's not a crowbar, it's not a fixed distance. If I were to make this widget half of its size, all of the spaces that I see here should become half of its size. Notice the other thing. This widget is not only, I'm kind of doing it in a chunky way, it's not only resizing in width, but it's also resizing in height based on the content of what is inside it. So parent containers inherit their rules from the children. I know, it's like your house. My house seems to be that way too. I seem to inherit the rules from my children. But the parent container says, based on everything inside of it, is it set to responsive behavior? If it is, it will reduce the overall container based on the content within it. If some of your objects are not set to responsive height and width, the parent container will change the rules of its behavior as far as whether or not it reduces height and width or just width. Hope you guys are with me. This is a big kitchen. Okay. What I want to do now is change some of the behaviors. Let's say I think that this particular image is just fine as it is, not scaling. I want it to be fixed size. So let's make it a little smaller. And I may decide I want it to always be in the corner of this container. So with it selected, I'm going to go in and change my resize attributes to none. Now magically, I can come in and define the responsive pinning behavior for that object. So when I set it as fixed height and width, pinning was enabled. This is on purpose If I do the same for this guy, I'll come on in and say, go ahead and have a resize attribute of none, and let's pin it to the right-hand side. Now, the left and right are going to behave like crowbars. So my expectation, because they're not scaling, is that it's going to start to bump into my image here before you know it. So let's go ahead and resize the image out and increase the chances that that happens. And I'm going to press and drag. Notice that that center image is set to be responsive width, so it's trimming down the image as I did it by design. The image on the left is fixed height and width. The one on the lower right, fixed height and width. Notice the other thing that's happening. This is where you get to raise your hand. Oh yes, you in the back. I know, too much time alone. Notice the thing that's happening to the container. The container is no longer getting smaller in height because I defined an object that's fixed. It's not fluid height and width. So that container height is not going to reduce. All right, I'm going to stop, look at some questions, see if I'm headed down the right path as far as helping you guys get a little closer to understanding what's going on. And then I got more to show you. Oh. All right, we've got more comments. Okay. So, I'm sorry, Mehmet, I'm not going to pronounce your name right. Would be perfect to have a sandbox site which allows users to practice different pinning scenarios online. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I had thought about just giving out that pinning layout example that Ali Deli delivered as something to experiment with. Yes, but you can do it all in Muse. It's just knowing every single option. So part of me wonders, do we build out a tutorial that gives you every single one of these examples and describes how each one was set and why that is true? We have a tech writer, and she's been struggling with trying to document a tutorial around all of these details because they're so subjective to what you're trying to do, and there are so many combinations. Let's keep going. I'm going to show you some scary engineering layouts that are test files that were shared with me yesterday. So if I jump out, let me just see here. That's one of them. Here's another. All right, so here's kind of some smart pinning testing. We pretty much went through, you know, the other thing I want to do, let's kind of come in here and add one more element to this design. So I'm going to come in and instead of this object here, let's take it away. And let's go back to these two initial images. Now, I mentioned this, I'm going to mention it again. If you have mixed pinning states, remember this guy's pinned to the left, this one's pinned to the right, and I can see that here. If I select both of them, I get a terrible UI that makes it look like nothing is pinned. Drives me crazy. We have, as I mentioned, some ideas to show mixed pinning states. What I can do to kind of unpin everybody is pin it somewhere, pin it in the center, and then unpin it. If I click off now, this guy should be unpinned, and this guy's unpinned. So you can select all, pin, and then unpin to sort of remove any pinning attributes you might have set. Let's go ahead and get some text in here. I'm going to do lazy man text generation. And I'll pop it in here. And we'll go ahead and give it a reasonable font. And make it a little larger. Okay, so just another aspect here. When I place text in a container, notice that I've placed this text. It's set to be not responsive height nor width. So I have the ability to pin it. I can pin it to the center. When I come in and set it as responsive width, it's going to inherit that percentage-based pinning mindset. It will have the responsive width. And notice I've got pretty much consistent spacing between each of these objects. If I now come in and scale content, notice what's happening. Couple things, and I really want to shout it out here. Number one is my text is almost disappearing. So if you are new to the new version of Muse, we made a conscious decision to stop trying to work so hard on the design canvas to interpret how text containers, as they become narrower or wider, affect objects down page, right? So when I click and release, it shows me how that text flowed. If I do that one more time, I drag back out. Notice that the container is getting a bit bigger and the text stops redrawing. We did this because the design canvas is getting really tired from multiple breakpoints with multiple widgets that have widgets nested inside of them, all of which have their own pinning and fluid behavior. So if I come on in here and make it quite small and I want to see what the text is doing, I can only tell that when I release and see that the container grows and the text flows down. So I'm getting to where things are overlapping a little bit here. If I come on into this object, again, there's going to come a time where it's just going to overlap one another. I probably would add a new breakpoint before that became so narrow that it started overlapping one another. All right, let's come in and take a look at some of those other examples. Okay, told you this was not a fashion contest here. So I've got a page here. It's a bunch of placed images. Let's just kind of dissect it a little bit. So I have an image frame, no background fill. It's just basically a placed image in each of these instances. If I select them all and want to try to figure out what's going on, so notice that as I click on individual items here, they're pinned separately. I'm going to select all. I'm going to click on something, pin center, and then I'm going to click again to unpin everyone. So I basically have a number of images that are placed. Each of those images are set to be responsive height and width. And again, if you know old Muse, when we first delivered responsive feature set, this was a challenge. You may or may not have an appreciation for why that's a challenge, having joined me for the last almost hour already, folks. But it's complex to decide how to handle this in a way that's going to use basically, again, someone raised their hand, percentage-based pinning, such that the spacing between these objects should be a percentage of the overall browser width. So as I get down to about 960, which is where it becomes a fluid breakpoint, right about there, notice as I resize that the height and the width of the container is being reduced and the spacing between these objects is being preserved. So I can come smaller and that spacing is going to remain consistent. I get a really nice grid behavior when I'm working there. If I come in, there's other bits that I want to jump around a little bit. I'm almost out of time. But if I come into just a brand new widget again, I'm going to select all and delete anything on the canvas. What I'm showing you in the composition widget is also true of the states button. A state button is a trigger target without a trigger, but it has that same behavior. If I come on in here, and let's say I place images, let's see if I can do this the right way. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to come on in and place them. It's going to be goofy. Put this guy in the middle, this guy here. And I select each of them and I set them to none for resize. I may or may not be able to show that up. Let's see. All right, we automatically did a little bit of logic there. So what did I do? I went in and I placed 3 images and I changed each of those images to be fixed in height and width. We're trying to use some innate intelligence here. Notice that when I set this to be fixed height and width, it went ahead and set the pinning attribute to the left. When I place it on the right, it pinned to the right. If you're within about, I think, 15% of center, the plan is that it would pin center automatically. I don't think I have that in the beta right now. But we're trying, again, to intuit what the behavior would be. If you're defining something as fixed height and width, our assumption is that you probably want to pin it to an edge. because it's not going to scale when the container or the browser breakpoint scales. So we're going to go ahead and rather than have it fall out of the container by default, we're going to pin it to the closest edge to that object. Okay, this is the beginning of a dialogue. The only way it's a jam session is if you reach out to me and let me know what your thoughts are, if you have additional questions. I'm reachable, not usually on Facebook and not on LinkedIn, by the way, because that's not a tech support area. You can send me an email at dani@adobe.com. Shout out if you have questions that haven't been covered about pinning and responsive behavior. I want to continue to try to roll this information together. And as one person suggested, if there's a way to have a sandbox or just some really nice test files, we're going to see if we can document this more so that it helps as you're breaking down each of your pieces. So if you have new jam session topics you want to cover, also let me know. I'll be back in 2 weeks. Not sure what I'll cover, but it's about 4 weeks out from Adobe Max. So I definitely am available to come up with a new topic. It'll probably be something related towards responsive design and the new features, but I'm open to topics. Thank you, everyone, for your time. As usual, I've really appreciated it, and I hope to see you again soon.